Well done. Okay. Okay, Karen, Janet, ready to start? Is that okay?
Yeah, if
Okay.
everybody can mute themselves who's not speaking, that'd be great.
Okay. Hi there, everybody. It's very good to see you all tonight. Lots of old faces and some new faces. I'm Hilda Palmer, and along with my colleague Janet Newsham, who's the coordinator of the Greater Manchester Hazards Centre and the chair of the National Hazards Campaign, who's organised this event, and David Gray-Donald of Between the Lines Books, we'd like to welcome you to the UK launch of Karen Messing's brilliant new book, Bent Out of Shape: Shame, Solidarity and Women's Bodies at Work. I'm first of all going to introduce the illustrious panel of speakers and to give a very brief introduction to the discussion. Shavanah Taj is Wales TUC's first Black and Ethnic Minority General Secretary. She joined Wales TUC in February 2019 from the Public and Commercial Services Union, PCS, where she'd been the Welsh Secretary since 2013. Shavanah is an eloquent, practical and passionate campaigner, a brilliant speaker at all sorts of events, roundtable debates, protest marches on issues such as anti-racism, human rights, women's rights, fair pay and fair work. Shavanah has to leave at 6:45, but we'll be able to hear a good deal of her before that. Our second speaker is Caroline Criado Perez, and I hope I've pronounced that properly, who's a writer, a broadcaster, an award-winning feminist campaigner, including co-founding the Women's Room, getting women on banknotes, and successfully campaigning for a statue of suffragist Millicent Fawcett to be erected in Parliament Square. She was the 2013 recipient of the Liberty Human Rights Campaigner of the Year and awarded an OBE in 2015. Her first book was Do It Like a Woman in 2015, and her current bestseller, Invisible Women, which you should all get and read. Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, was published in 2019 and is very directly relevant to the discussion today. And our chief speaker, Dr. Karen Messing, who we are really privileged to have with us today. Professor of Biology at the University of Quebec at Montreal in Canada for decades. She's researched issues around all kinds of women's work in partnership with 3 major trade union confederations and women's committees and women's groups. And she's trained in ergonomics and genetics and has trained many researchers in these fields. She's an inspirational, award-winning, internationally known and acclaimed expert in occupational health from a gender perspective. The author of many scientific papers and reports, Karen has written 3 major books and set the agenda for studying, measuring, and making visible the sex and gender issues affecting women's health at work and how to organize for improvements. Karen has written One-Eyed Science in 1998, Occupational Health and Women Workers, Pain and Prejudice, 2015, What Science Can Learn About Work from the People Who Do It, and Bent Out of Shape, 2021, Shame, Solidarity and Women's Bodies at Work. Karen has been involved in establishing research centres and programmes on occupational and environmental health, on work and gender, and feminist research groups, and has actually had a massive effect and impact all around the world in terms of research and policy making on women and work. And Karen herself and her research and writing have been an enormous inspiration, teaching me and many other women in occupational health and safety in UK unions to ask questions to win the trust of women, how to observe, learn and measure what women actually do, and to expose the problems that assume the default worker is male and predominantly young, fit and white male at that, which doesn't apply to men from different ethnic groups, ages and health, and it certainly doesn't apply to women. And the lack of research on women workers, so tools and PPE don't fit, ignoring sex-based issues of hormones, menstruation, pregnancy, breastfeeding, menopause, and of gendered roles and stereotypes based on this and the work and family interfaces and the harm that the combined effect of all of this causes women. And she showed us how to make visible, to make the invisible that hurts us visible. In 2008, she came and spoke at our annual Hazards Conference, summarizing all of these complex issues with very clear examples, practical examples in 20 minutes, which had a major impact on our 350 safety rep delegates. Her writing in Bent Out of Shape is direct, accessible, engaging, warm, empathetic, and humorous, describing real work, not assigned jobs. And it's unflinching. She faces the dragon head on. She's honest about mistakes and learning. She's generous about the different approaches of sister researchers, about failures and successes, about the complexity of the real working lives of women, And she sets out the conflicts that we must acknowledge between health and equality, for example, if we're to make real improvements in women's work in terms of ergonomic stress, chemical exposures, work scheduling and organization, and to tackle both the effects of work caused by having different bodies from men and also the imposed gender roles and stereotypes. And I think she frames all these issues with enormous clarity into a form that we can both understand and debate. And I think particularly resonating with me and many of us, she tackles the shame and the guilt we feel at being treated as second sex, second gender, second class, when the work doesn't fit our bodies or our lives, and asking for changes is seen as special pleading. And her book calls for solidarity to name it and start to overcome that shame as essential to begin to tackle our needs for health and equality. I'm going to ask Shavanah and Caroline to speak first for 5 minutes or so about their feelings about Karen's book. And then I'm going to ask Karen to speak for 5 to 10 minutes. And then Shavanah and Caroline will ask some questions of Karen, which she will address, and then we'll open it up to wider discussion. So can I ask Shavanah if you would speak first of all? Thank you.
Firstly, thanks to the team at Hazards for inviting me to the launch of Karen's book, which if you haven't actually got your hands on, honestly, like genuinely prioritize it, because not only is it a good read, it's actually really practical. So make sure that you do that. So I wanted to kind of touch on a couple of things that Karen's book actually talks about, which is that people come in all shapes and sizes. So when it comes to health and safety, the assumed one size fits all approach is definitely outdated. It's extremely dangerous. And there is this common misunderstanding that everything changes if we are all treated the same or equally. But we know that in the past, health and safety needs of men in the workplace have been prioritized over women. Risk prevention has focused visibly on visibly dangerous work, largely carried out by men in industries like construction and mining, with an assumption that the kind of work that women do is safer. And when women do work in areas that have traditionally been done by men, they often find that when they are given equipment to protect them at work, it's often designed for men. So, where the differences between men and women are considered when assessing risk and deciding suitable risk control solution, there is a greater chance of ensuring that the health, safety and welfare of all workers is protected. So through years of research and worker studies by trade unions, we know that women are more exposed to repetitive and monotonous work and to stressful conditions. They're more likely to experience harassment at work than men. And women are more likely than men to develop, a range of different issues, including back strain, skin diseases, headaches, eye strain, and many other issues as well. And of course, there's also, we've seen during the pandemic, for example, that it was actually women who took on a lot of the responsibilities, for example, around homeschooling. It was they who had to juggle homeschooling with homeworking and the additional household chores as well. So, and they were working all sorts of crazy hours, often throughout the night, with no risk assessment that focused on any aspect, be that mental health and well-being or their physical strains that were impacting women. So, some health and safety risks are most likely to affect women, particularly those who are pregnant, trying to get pregnant as well. And again, the crisis has shown how for women working in key roles, the crisis has been a matter of life and death. And there's been lots of, conflicting and confusing advice as well. And some employers have not actually conducted risk assessments for pregnant workers. Unions have seen some employers have been furloughing pregnant workers or sending them home on statutory sick pay, completely in breach of women's rights under health and safety law, where a risk's been identified in the case of exposure to COVID, the employer, has to take reasonable action. But we've seen all kinds of really bad practices. And again, of course, in the UK, we've seen and heard from GMB and Unite the Union about the many cases of health and safety breaches of work in well-known companies like Amazon warehouses and other Bezos-owned businesses, where women have been too scared to speak up about the need for reasonable adjustments because of repetitive strain injuries, inappropriate equipment, and so forth. All being ignored when they've been requesting. And of course, they don't have proper access to proper sick pay or maternity care as well. And, we've heard of awful situations where women have actually been given birth whilst at work, as they've been fearful of speaking up about what would happen, because they've been worried about their job security and low pay. And again, Karen's book most definitely links us back to the deeply ingrained aspects of shame that she speaks about. And you know, we know of many cases of this being very, very real. I think that, you know, I've got to say, I'm particularly excited with the prospect of an international campaign to unionize Amazon workers now that is being pursued by the new General Secretary of Unite, Sharon Graham. I think that this is going to be a real game changer. But also, I think that it's important to, you know, refer back to the fact that the pandemic has given a rise to a new cohort of potential health and safety reps, with approximately 110,000 now in workplaces across Britain. We've seen PPE not fitting properly. We've seen of, you know, inappropriate and unsafe use of PPE. Again, women's bodies, you know, including pregnant bodies, not being taken into account because the average size for fitting of PPE is for men. So it's not designed for women at all. But again, I think, you know, we saw, and I end on this point, that during the pandemic, we saw how it's often women who were caught up in those intersections of oppression, be that race, class, gender, and other forms of oppression. And as the infamous feminist Mona Lathaway says, we must take patriarchy, we must make patriarchy fear us and reject politeness, as there's nothing polite about patriarchy. We must reject civility. There is nothing civil about racism or misogyny. And this is where I'm particularly interested in the theme of shame that features throughout the book. You know, as a Muslim Pakistani woman, I know too well how shame and honor intersects with race and all kinds of forms of discrimination. And I know and understand how those politics of respectability are used by so many people to marginalize women, particularly minoritized women as well, and to police us and control and replicate these, you know, mainstream values, and just actually make our working lives utter hell. So I'm going to end there. But I am sure this conversation is going to be amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shavanah. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Yes, we need to take on patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism, and we need to fight back. Can we now have Caroline? Will you now?
Yes. Hello.
Yes, please.
So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm really honoured and actually quite overwhelmed to be on this panel. My first encounter with Karen's work was as a graduate student at LSE, when a book she wrote a chapter for was on my reading list, and I've never forgotten the title. It was "Don't Use a Wrench to Peel Potatoes. Biological Science Constructed on Male Model Systems is a Risk to Women Workers' Health." And anyone who knows my work or has read Invisible Women can imagine just from that chapter heading what an impact Karen's work has had on my own. I remember how angry I felt, but also how invigorated I felt reading her work. And I think part of that, and this is something that is also very visible in this book, is that I felt often really frustrated reading academic literature, that it felt so far removed from the lives of real women and too caught up in sort of abstruse concepts and philosophical debates and unwilling to put, you know, your neck on the line and actually say something. Anyway, that's how it felt to me at the time. But, you know, here was this academic, this professor, writing so concretely about women's bodies, about the lack of interest in them in mainstream science, about how female workers are being ignored and let down by occupational health research. You know, there was so much to infuriate me. And I've just gone back and looked at my notes and sort of seen that as I took notes from the chapter, there was lots of little lines saying, ah! Things like the refusal to investigate the menstrual cycle in the workplace and how little has changed since then. Obviously, she wasn't saying how little has changed since then, but as I'm looking back on my notes, I'm thinking how little has changed since then. The lack of funding into for research into, this was the one that really got me, female-specific workplace exposures, because there wasn't enough evidence to prove they existed, because the research had never been done. The habit of adjusting for sex, or excluding women from occupational health research altogether, as if women are a confounding factor rather than, you know, half the world. And I just want to highlight one paragraph that particularly stuck with me, because I feel like this was like a really foundational paragraph for me. This is basically just a rant to tell you how amazing you are, Karen. So I hope that's okay, Hilda. I hope that's what you were looking for my 5 minutes. And I just have this vivid memory of telling a male classmate of mine about this particular paragraph during a debate about male and female relative strength. He wasn't convinced, something that I'm sure Karen will not be surprised by. But this is the paragraph. In biological terms, men and women are distributed along overlapping normal curves of height, weight, ability to lift weights, endurance, patience, and dexterity. The degree of overlap varies with the characteristic. There is more overlap in the strength required to push weights than to lift them. However, the degree of overlap can be changed by changing the job characteristics. Use of appropriate equipment can transform lifting motions into pushing, and using different tools can permit smaller workers to take advantage of their greater flexibility. And that paragraph just completely blew my mind. You know, the idea that we could adapt workplaces rather than just accepting that women couldn't do such certain jobs was an absolute revelation to me. And that revelation has clearly gone on to inform so much of what I've done since then. And in that chapter, don't worry, I'm going to talk about the book in a second. Karen also spoke about the obstacles she faced from a sexist scientific establishment who thought her research was not important enough because it was A, on women, B, on working class women, and C, actually included the voices of those working class women as part of the research. But even so, that did not prepare me for the absolute white hot fury I felt reading Karen's new book, which documents a lifetime in these trenches, fighting these battles in the face of employers and actually, worst of all, unions who don't seem to want to know. But it's not just anger inducing, you know, like that chapter of Karen's I read back in 2013. It is invigorating and it's inspiring because despite these obstacles, Karen has just amazingly kept going. And she has actually empowered, you know, not sort of the fake empowered gets overused, but she has genuinely empowered so many female workers with knowledge and with data and with perhaps the most important thing, and it is in the title of the book, solidarity, which I think is one of the main takeaways of the book. Beyond the fury at the obstacles and the intransigence and the sheer stupidity and obtuseness, the importance of solidarity among women and women in the workplace, because what this book really shows, and it is a hopeful book, I think, overall, it shows that change is possible and that progress is possible if women have the bravery to stick together, which is a whole other topic, because one of the sad things of the book is how often women don't have the bravery to stick together because we have the coping mechanism of hoping that people won't notice that we're women and therefore will treat us like human beings. And I'm hoping that Karen might mention something about that, because for me, that was one of the things that I found most disheartening and I would most like a sort of solution to is how do we handle this very understandable reaction from women of not wanting to work together because they worry that that will draw attention to them and increase the sort of negative consequences that they're already experiencing. But anyway, that's enough from me. Let's all hear from Karen, who we're actually all here to hear from.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was absolutely brilliant. That's fine. That's absolutely brilliant. That contributes to the discussion brilliantly. But now, yes, can we hear from Karen herself?
Yes, except I'm overwhelmed by the people that talked before me. So I guess the first thing to say about besides thank you and my goodness and so nice of you is that I've stopped, Carolyn, talking about overlapping capacities because all the guys would make jokes about overlapping. So that'll tell you something, I guess. And the other thing I guess I wanted to say before getting into what I already wrote down is that I'm really happy to be in a group of organized by unions and union sympathizers, because if we're going to be able to develop this kind of solidarity, this is the place to start. And of course, the hazard campaign, which I got to know a bit in the 2000s, has been going strong for such a long time in doing this kind of linking. So, and we don't have anything like that in Canada in terms of informal movements linked to the trade union movement. I'm really jealous about that. So anyway, that's what I didn't write down. Here's what I wrote down, which is the thing that the paradox that led me to write this book is I was sitting with a feminist scholar, and we were writing an article on sex differences and how occupational health scientists should think about sex differences. And I wanted to write about dysmenorrhea. And she said, no, we can't write about anything to do with menstruation because we don't really want people to emphasize the male-female differences. And I was upset by that because if we can't talk about menstruation and we can't talk about pregnancy and we can't talk about differences in size, then we can't talk about a whole bunch of things that women face every day in the workplace. So that's why I wrote the book. And where it came from, and I do want to emphasize this because yes, I did say some nasty things about some union higher ups in my book, but the book grew out of many years, I guess 35 years of collaborating with women's committees in the trade unions in Canada and the health and safety committees in Canada. And if I hadn't had that wonderful partnership, I wouldn't have learned anything because I was quite, as I tell a few stories about how ignorant I was before I started listening to these unionized women. And I should just tell you that we had a 15-year formal partnership between the women's committees and the health and safety committees of the three major unions in Quebec, the union confederations in Quebec. And it was called L'Invisible Femelle, which means invisible things that hurt you. And it started out to be about those invisible hazards in women's work, like highly repetitive work and prolonged static standing, the kind of thing that looks like it's not going to do you any harm, but it actually can ruin your life. And we had a number of gains from this university union collaboration. The first was, and I want to point this out because it may be something you might want to look into, or perhaps you're already doing it, is that our unions have women's committees, and they have them at every level, from the confederation level to the different federations, professional federations, to the regional levels and down to the local unions. Now, not all local unions have them, but a whack of us do. So there are the women's committees. And then similarly, there are health and safety committees. And guess what? Most of those are male workers. And so the partnership actually brought together the women's committees and the health and safety committees. And that was its first accomplishment, because it was the first time that these women were actually finding a group of accessible male workers to interact with and to work on common issues with. And the other type of gains that we have were on local transformational level and also on policy, government policy level, because I'm an ergonomist, but we were partnered with legal specialists, policy specialists, who would take the findings that we had at the local level on specific working conditions, and they would think about how can this be transformed into policy. So for example, on things like work-family balancing, we were doing studies of scheduling and how scheduling, the interface between women's schedules and their lives, their working schedules and their lives, or the different points at which your work interfaces with your home life, were being completely destroyed by these random schedules that are done by computers. And the policy people turned this into requirements for advanced scheduling and also questions of family leave, backed up by the data that we were able to generate on the inconveniences posed for mostly women workers, but also many men workers. So what I'm trying to say is that this partnership between the university people and the unions was actually able to affect change. We had three phases, and if you read the book, and I'm sort of hoping that you will, there's a phase where we were interested in first just revealing the different problems in women's jobs. And I also had a previous book about the invisible damage. And then the second part of it was what happens when women enter jobs that were designed with only men in mind, not so-called non-traditional jobs for women. And getting recognition for the invisible hazards was not easy, but it was a lot easier than getting change for the women in the non-traditional workplaces, because there we were really attacking the foundational organization of work. And we were also asking employers to spend money on changing equipment, on changing the work site, on changing the way things were done. And we were also asking them to intervene among workers on such things as sexual harassment. And our first terrible experience, but one of several, was working with women where we didn't know this, but why we were called in was a woman had been raped on the job. And we only found this out many months later, but everybody, all the women we spoke to were saying, we have no special problems. We can do this job. We don't really need any specific actions. And it took a long time for the women to be able to tell us what was really happening. And it's that feeling of shame, which I think most women can recognize and identify with and own, about if we're different, there must be something wrong with us. And so we better either pretend it isn't happening or change real quick. Whoops, I can't change exactly. Well, what am I going to do? Well, maybe I'll just sort of play dead or play it low. And so that kind of feeling of shame was very important to me at the beginning of the book. And particularly because when I started writing, the Me Too movement was just starting and I was really identifying with that. So I'm telling you all these feelings that made me write the book. I should tell you what's in the book, which is that I tried to describe the relevant biological differences between women and men. It isn't exhaustive. When I'm a subscriber of Carolyn Criado Perez's newsletter, and she just told me about another one in her newsletter. Who knew that women had different proportions of their fingers, so the gloves had to be thought of, not just smaller gloves, but redesigned gloves had to be thought of. I mean, thank you, Carolyn. And there's lots more that I probably didn't find, but I did try to summarize what I knew about biological differences, and then ask what is the relationship between these biological differences and the job segregation that we can see before us every day. And that was reflected, as somebody, I guess it was Shav, mentioned that during COVID, we see that that women are in the kinds of jobs where they're constantly exposed to other human beings. That's because that's the jobs that we are given. And therefore we're more exposed to COVID, which has been coming out in the numbers. So then I look at the biological differences, I look at the job segregation, and then I examine some of the studies that we did to try and change things. And then I described some of the obstacles we faced. And then I asked the question, if we were dealing with a feminist employer, would it be any different? Because we actually are still involved with doing some studies of the work of women who are social workers in shelters for women who are victims of conjugal violence. And the answer is actually it did change something. So if you want to just remove all your employers and substitute feminists. It won't make things perfect, but I don't think you'll have Amazon anymore. And then let's see what else. Yeah, I am told that you want or you're thinking about using the book to organize, and I want to say that something that's a really critical thing to organize around is that women who are, whether they be in non-traditional jobs or more traditional jobs, there is always a question: if my health is getting injured and I speak up, is somebody just going to say, well, if you're not up to the job, if you're not strong enough, if you're too small, if you're too weak, you should probably go somewhere else. So our need for equality, for being treated like an equal, and for economic survival is often put in direct contrast or direct opposition to our health. And this contradiction for women is very important, and something has to be done about it. And I think trade unions and the Hazard Campaign are uniquely positioned to be able to do that. So I'm hoping that that will be helpful, and I'd be very glad to listen to your whatever questions, comments, and new ideas you have for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was absolutely brilliant. You summarized an enormous amount of work and thinking in a very short and very concise way. Can we start with Shavanah? Would you like to ask your question of Karen? And can other people post their questions in the chat, and we'll pick them up later? We've got one from Kat Cray at the moment, and someone from Una. But Shavanah, would you like to ask your question, and then Caroline will ask hers, and then we'll open it up a bit more widely?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So in your book, you talk about reconciling equality with women's health and safety, and how the first step towards this is to get rid of the shame that overcomes us when we are attacked or ignored in the workplace. And you've spoken about that in your contribution so far. My question is, what does this reconciliation look like and feel like for some pursuing a framework of reconciliation and a sense of freedom through a Western lens can sometimes lead to real disappointment, particularly for minoritized BME women. And I say this, I guess, in the context of what we're seeing in a situation, for example, of Afghanistan, where you've had women coming out protesting, and this idea that actually what the women of Afghanistan are seeking equates to exactly the same framework that women in the West, predominantly white women, for example, are feeling or are seeking as well. So what does that, I guess, that reconciliation look like as far as health and safety is concerned through that sort of intersectional lens?
Karen, you're muted.
Oh,
You're all right
actually,
now.
no, I'm not. Okay.
You're okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen reconciliation yet, I have to say. It's very hard to imagine. I mean, what we see in Afghanistan is women getting beaten. What we see here in Quebec is a lot of opposition when women get together. So I guess if I'm going to be optimistic, and I guess I should be, if I want to inspire people, is that we have been able to create a certain number of mechanisms to protect the women. I talked about the women's groups, the women's committees in the unions. They've done a tremendous job. Have they been able to do a tremendous job for immigrant women, for women of color? Not a lot yet. I've seen it be tried because there are companies in Montreal that hire immigrant women, for example, clothing manufacturers. And what they do is they separate the women from the same community. So they'll like put a Chinese woman, and then next to her will be a Pakistani woman, and next to her will be somebody from Eastern Europe. And so that in the hope they won't speak to each other. And I have to tell you, it doesn't work because they do speak to each other. So it is possible for people, and they have an active union, and the union works on this with them, and they do some heroic things. So it's possible. It starts with people speaking to each other. Out of people speaking to each other, we built a research center. We built in the university, which is kind of an easier environment. We built a women's research program that turned into a women's research institute. We've been able to build things. It takes a long time. The work is never over. They're constantly trying to close us down as we speak. They're trying to close us down. But I think it starts with women speaking to each other and trying not to be ashamed of whatever that looks like, or trying to to start by recognizing that we feel ashamed of being women, and we feel ashamed of our bodies, and we're terribly afraid that we're really no good, and then just supporting each other. But I don't know if that is satisfactory to you.
Thank you, Karen. Can I ask Caroline, can I ask you to ask a question?
Yes. So I had prepared 2 questions. Do you want me to choose just one of them?
Hilda, you're muted.
Apologize. Yes, I did ask you to prepare 2. Can you just give one for now, Caroline, and then we'll go back if we've got time to Shavanah before she has to leave.
Tricky. All right. Okay. So, which is my favorite question?
You probably get a chance to ask both. Go on. Just
okay. All right. So, in my own writing, I've really tried as far as possible to focus on bad systems as opposed to bad people, because I find that's the best way to try and bring as many people as possible with you. But reading your book, I'm struck by how often the blockage is defensive, offended men. And I must admit, I find the stories enraging and extremely depressing. And I suppose my question is, what can we do about this defensiveness from not all men, but some men, enough men? How can we get around it to make the changes that are needed? Because it just kept coming up again and again and again in your book, and it was infuriating.
I guess I should start by saying there's a lot of opposition from women too. The thing is that the reason that it comes up so often with men is just that they are more apt to be in positions of power. So if somebody's gonna want to shut you up and they have a lot of power, then that's when you have to worry about them. Whereas with women wanting to shut you up, sometimes you can reason with them, and sometimes you can't, but usually they don't have the same power. So how have we done it? I remember, and I don't know if this is the right story to tell, but Donna, my co-founder of our research center, Donna and I were called into the office of the head of a granting agency in the area of health and safety many years ago, and it had been voted to give us some money, and he was really worried about it because he didn't like the fact that the 2 of us were co-heads of the organization of our research group, and so he wanted us to name one of us, and we were quite committed to being jointly responsible. And he said, well, every train needs an engine. And we said that we could be 2 in the engineer's office. So we finally won, and we went out of his office, and then we chugged down the street going toot, 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 the 2 of us in triumph. And I think it's why that's a nice story is that I think that Donna and I had never felt so close. as when we were fighting that battle. And we eventually got a couple of million out of that research organization. So you feel a little bit less bad about how they're treating you when you win. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I guess you just, keep fighting.
Okay. Shavanah, have you got enough time to stay to ask your second question, and then we'll go back to Caroline for hers?
Yeah, I'm going to log off. But before I do, my second question, Karen, was in chapter 4, Jobs and Bodies, you explore disaggregate jobs. And there's some amazing, like really useful, great case studies in there, observing gender differences in physical task assignments, particularly in food service. And there's this example of this large print shop whose managers had decided not to hire women anymore, since they'd argued that too many women were complaining of musculoskeletal disorder induced by work. And you describe how when the ergonomics gave their report on gender task demands to the worker and managers, that women actually wept. Because of the state of their exhaustion and the fact that the pain that they had been going through was finally being acknowledged. And you talked about, the real taboos surrounding gender inequalities and how companies find it hard to treat questions of gender and equality directly. So my question is, why do you think this is such an issue, and how can we overcome such challenges? But I can't stay, unfortunately, for your answer. I am so sorry, and I'm really embarrassed about this, but I have to go now. Thank you so much for inviting me to join the panel, and I hope the rest of the evening goes well. And yes, I am anyone who hasn't read this book, please do download it, read it, whatever you need to do. It's amazing.
Thank you very much, Shavanah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I understand you have to go, very typical woman thing. You've got a conflict with family and work. That's great. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for your input. And it was great to have you on our panel. Thank you very much. Karen, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, the research that Shav is referring to was actually done in France by the organisation ANACT, Agence Nationale pour l'Amélioration des Conditions de Travail, and it's a government agency. And they sent ergonomists into various workplaces. And this was a print shop that a team of ergonomists actually went in and did a lot of observation of the work process. And what they discovered was that it was a place where they printed books. And so you had these big, thick books that had to be brought around from one place to the other. It was very taxing for the wrists, very taxing for the shoulders. And the number, because of automation, the number of books handled by the women had more than doubled in the previous few years. Whereas because of automation, the jobs that the men had, which were supervising the machines, had actually decreased. And so once they had documented this, the employer, who thought that the women were getting these musculoskeletal problems because they were women, actually realized that they were getting these problems because the work was too hard and it had become a lot harder. And so the ergonomist said, well, we'll tell them and then they'll change things, right? And it didn't happen like that at all. What happened was they gave the results in, and as Shav was telling you, the women were just overcome because finally their workload was being recognized, and finally they were not being told that they were old and weak, but they were being told they were working too hard, which of course they already knew, but on the other hand, they hadn't been so sure, and they needed somebody else to validate their experience. And what was amazing about it, and it's Florence Chapelle from ANACT who told us about this, she said that the employer didn't dispute the conclusions, but they said they weren't going to change anything because the men wouldn't like it. And they didn't change anything. And so what Florence and her gang did was go and get a law put in place in France, which is still in effect. This was in 2014, saying that employers had to look at health and safety by gender and had to think about gender when they were doing their reviews of health and safety, which was a good result. But Shav's question also speaks to the resistance to this kind of result. And I have to say that when we presented our results on the desegregation of jobs to the unions, the women's committees put out a beautiful little pamphlet on the differences between what is required of men and women, both within the same job and in sex segregated jobs. And they said, oh, well, we'll have a joint meeting between the women's committees and the health and safety committees with a couple of hundred people, and we'll discuss all this, and then we'll see what we can do. And it turned into an unbearable fight, because people in that situation, they talk about, well, my wife prefers to do the laundry. Well, I really don't know how to fix the window. It becomes very personal, very intimate, and we're attacking people's gut feelings about who they are and who they've married and how they bring up their children. So it's a very, very emotional thing, and it gets emotional very fast. And we haven't discovered an easy way to do these discussions at all, because when people are relatively used to discussing things like at the level where a women's committee will exchange with a health and safety committee, that has been successful. When it's mass meetings, I don't have an answer. And so I think that, and the other problem we have is getting release time, which in unions here at least is just not easy to get. You can get the time to do an inspection or something like that, but to sit down for hours and thrash out women and men and nature and why women have to walk faster than men and within the same job, it's complicated. It takes time. It takes a lot of openness, and not everybody's open. It takes a lot of people shutting up, and not everybody likes to shut up. And active union members are often selected for being people that are not particularly easy to shut up, which is a good thing. So I don't have an answer for Shav's question, but it's something that I will be very interested to watch you deal with.
I think that's a really, really difficult problem. I think, we know we have to find ways to actually have these discussions and mechanisms and structures, but we are dealing with very, very, as you say, very complicated issues that people feel very strongly and very emotionally and often very defensively, and to deal with them in a constructive way is actually very difficult. And I think for a long time we haven't actually been tackling these. We've been hiving them off into different areas, into equalities or into health and safety, and then actually missing all the main points and not really having these discussions. Caroline, do you want to have a go at your second question, and then we'll open it up to everybody? I
do, yes. So where is my second question after all that? Yes. So obviously I work on trying to close the gender data gap, and therefore have great faith in the power of data to fix things and change minds. But something that I have come across is that sometimes, even when we have the data, we don't want to listen to it. And there was this particularly excruciating example in the book that you talk about in the hospital, where they were convinced that the men were doing more of the heavy lifting than the women, and there was a big problem with this. And then it turned out when you collected the data, it actually was totally opposite way around. Women were doing more of the heavy lifting, but Vincent did not want to accept this and just wouldn't believe the data. And I just sort of, wondered, what do you think we do when people don't want to hear data that they don't like?
Yes, it was a problem. I have to say that we were never successful in that particular hospital. Well, I don't know. We didn't do a follow-up study, I should say. We probably should have gone back, although I don't know that we would have been welcome. That we had delivered our results, which were the women and the men were saying it's unfair that women and men in healthcare, personal support workers, that they are given the same job title, paid the same, and asked to do the same work, because the men are doing much more of the heavy lifting than the women. And so and this is a problem. So I thought this was an excellent research question. We got money to study it. We contacted a whack of hospitals asking them, can we study this in your hospital? Everybody said no. One hospital said, you are welcome to come and study musculoskeletal disorders among this group, because we're quite worried about their musculoskeletal disorders, but we don't want you talking about gender because it'll just make everybody get mad at each other. So we went in and we did our study, and of course we disaggregated our observations by sex, and we found that the women were actually doing more lifts per hour than the men. That said, when there was an extreme case of asking people for physical exertion, example, a psychotic patient is going berserk and somebody's got to contain them. A hugely obese patient is falling out of her wheelchair and somebody's got to catch her. That kind of thing. Or you want to hold down somebody in order to, who's resisting, in order to give them an injection. In those cases, which were extremely rare, men were being asked to do the more extremely dangerous and impressively dangerous tasks. So there was a reason why Vincent was being so close-minded about it, is that, maybe once a week something would happen that was looking dangerous, and that had to be thought about, and we had to admit it. But for sure, in the context of half an hour that we had to present our research results, there was a shock because the results were unexpected. A lot of people had a lot of things to say. Some people agreed, some people didn't agree. The hospital hierarchy, which was all male, had not consulted the nursing hierarchy, who were the immediate bosses of these people. And they had been left out of the discussion entirely. And they actually were quite interested in our conclusion. So you're dealing with a complex system. And as with any ergonomic study, you have to find the point at which you can exert the pressure to change. And in that first encounter, we didn't find the lever. And the only thing we did do was we wrote up our report, we gave it to the union hierarchy. They used it in various training sessions, and they've used it all over the place. So it's more of a long-term investment, I guess I would say. You can't expect people to, or at least you can't expect people who are heavily invested in a specific situation to change their most basic ideas right away. There's got to be some kind of an evolution. And in the book, I have the example of cleaners, where we're looking at what's happening over a long period of time, and some good things are happening and some bad things are happening, but there's an evolution going on. And I guess that's all I can say about that.
It's the same old, age-old question. It's a question of, education, agitation, and organizing, isn't it? It's giving you're producing and finding the data and investigating it, and then it's about unions trying to find the ways to actually, educate members and agitate and organize around those issues and try to find those ways of doing something about it. Karen mentioned your newsletter. I also sign up to that. I don't know if you could put the information about that in the chat line, or we can make sure we add that to the information to make sure that goes out for everybody. Can we
It's
open it up?
really interesting, that newsletter.
Yeah, it is absolutely fabulous. Caroline really is actually doing the analysis of the data on sex and gender differences that we all really, really need to know about. Can we have got time? I think we've got about another, is it another half an hour, Janet?
Whatever you'd like.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions. A question from Kat Cray, and I think I'd ask Kat to ask it, and then one from Helen Lynn. Can we start with those two? Kat, can you ask your question first, and then Helen, and then we'll get Karen and maybe Caroline to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Kat. I'm a health and safety rep on the Tube, and I'm a member of the RMT union. And the question, I can't remember it word for word, that I typed in the chat was to do with how our equality committees actually function. So in my union, they're rendered pretty powerless. They can ask for things, but their demands don't have to be met. And there's some great women in my union doing some work about that. But as I work in a male-dominated industry, and I'm a member of a male-dominated union, and I'm a health and safety rep, of which there is a very small amount of women. And it becomes quite exhausting being the only person in the room saying, can we talk about heavy periods? Can we talk about miscarriage? Can we talk about pregnancy? Can we talk about PPE? Can we talk about the fact that our uniforms don't fit us? And I think my question, perhaps it's a rhetorical one or an unfair question to ask you, is, you know, what do we do about that? So as women who are health and safety reps and are often in rooms full of men most of the time in my meetings, what do we do that maintains our own health and safety, our well-being, so we're not exhausted, but we do continue to further that agenda? So I appreciate it's unfair, but I think it's a subject of interest to the people here.
Okay, Kat, that's a good question. Let's just hold on to that thought, Karen and Caroline. Helen Lynn, could you ask your question?
Sorry. Well, I suppose I'm just very worried about the exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals in the workplace, something that Karen mentioned in her book as well. Also to women and the developing fetus, especially in the first 3 months of pregnancy, because I think it perpetuates health problems. And I think there should be regulations that protect everybody and be set at levels which protect the vulnerable fetus. But we have to consistently prove that that these chemicals are having an impact on us. They also impact on menstruation as well and menopause. And it's a very gendered sort of debate. I'm just wondering how we sort of progress this really, and if there's any kind of advice you could suggest. Thank you.
Before you answer that, can I just mention Audrey Silver has posted to say, UK management regs say that employers must assess the risk to the unborn child, i.e. not waiting for notification of pregnancy and then assessing. Very rarely have I found such a preemptive assessment. I mean, this is true. There are regulations about new and expectant mothers and risk assessments that must be carried out. And they are supposed to be done where there are women workers of childbearing age, because the effect on the unborn fetus will be happening well before women actually either know they're pregnant or notify their employer that they're pregnant. So the risk assessment and the prevention of those risks must be done before that. But she's absolutely right in that it's very rarely done beforehand, and then it's often done as an individual risk assessment on the person. So in some ways that also goes along with Karen's question. With Helen's question. Karen, would you like to answer that first?
Well, I'll answer Kat's question first, and then Helen's, if that's okay. So for Kat, my only experience is that I was myself a founding member of the Women's Committee of my union, and in a male-dominated union, which is Professors Union. And yes, it's not easy at the beginning. It's not easy also to get the other women to join you, because that means for them that they're making themselves visible as women, when it's not the easiest thing to be in a non-traditional workplace. So I guess hats off to you for one thing. For another, once there's two of you, you should never be the only woman in the room. If you can't get them to let two of you in, don't go. I mean, it's too hard. And it doesn't get you anywhere. It just means you're going to be marginalized. Once there's two of you, that's different. It's amazing the difference between one and two. So I guess that would be my response. And then the other thing is that there's, I'm sorry, I don't remember the names of people too well, but there are women in transport, and there's a kind of a collective transport workers thing where I've spoken to some very active women, and I could send Hilda the coordinates of those people. So because if you're not in contact with them, then that might be helpful. So that's the best I can do. And Hilda, do you have Kat's?
Helen, the one on endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Yeah, okay. So now for again, I don't know your situation in Great Britain, because we have in Quebec a law, and you'll tell me if you have one like it. Our law says that a woman exposed to a condition that poses a danger for her health as a function of her pregnancy or for the developing fetus can ask for a special leave from the time of the danger or the time of the pregnancy until the danger or the pregnancy is over. And that this is to be decided in the first instance by her personal physician after consultation with a public health physician. So this law is used in about, I think the figure is 30 to 40% of pregnancies of pregnant workers in Quebec, which of course made the employers extremely angry. And they've been fighting to overturn it ever since. And every time the law comes up, they try to abolish it. And every time there's a coalition of public health workers, women's groups, unions, that get together to fight them. So, and we've been able to conserve this. So if you don't have a law like that, that would be the first thing to do. Now, the latest contestation, which is going on right now, the latest battle, and it's as we speak, they're in parliamentary commission debating this, is that they're trying to make there be a list, a pre-accepted list of what chemicals and what conditions exactly they're going to allow. And that's a terrible idea, because each job has a specific articulation with the dangers, and so it's very hard to generalize. And they wanted the labor ministry to be in charge of it, and we've just gotten them to say, okay, it can be the public health people, because the public health people, by and large, they're in the business of protecting health. And so if you have a choice, because occupational health and safety is at the intersection of labor ministries and health ministries, you want to make sure that the pressure is kept so that it's toward the health ministries. I guess that would be the other piece of advice that I would give. And then the idea of forming a coalition between the environmentalist groups, the women's groups, and the labor groups is something that we found very powerful. Now, we're a province of 8 million people, and you're a country that's somewhat bigger, and it may be harder to make these coalitions, but that's what we've been able to build up.
Caroline, have you got anything you want to add to that? Caroline, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just saying, I think Karen has answered both those questions with much more skill than I could. So,
okay, but I think the thing there, to Kat's question, you know, Karen's right in the sense that the more people you have, you need more of you to be saying these. Otherwise, the burden does just fall on you, and then you're easy there to be picked off. And that is the whole argument about getting more women's safety reps, and also about, making links. Una has posted that she'd like to link up with you, is to develop networks and support groups that will actually sustain us through solidarity, through all of this, that we otherwise, we will be picked off. Karen's, your points about pregnant women and their exposure to chemicals or to other risks at work, and their rights to be put on special leave. I mean, that sounds absolutely wonderful. We do have laws that control this, and certain sorts of jobs, women have the right to be put on medical suspension on full pay because they can't do that, like diving and a few other jobs. It's extremely limited, and how poor it is has been absolutely and utterly exposed during the COVID pandemic, when we know that pregnant women are at huge risk from catching COVID. And so women in high risk circumstances and public facing roles where they're more likely to catch it have not been able to get access to this and have been treated absolutely appallingly by their employers. But Helen's point about endocrine disrupting chemicals, I mean, in the UK, we don't really have at the moment any acceptance by employers or the HSE that endocrine disrupting chemicals are really even a problem. And we're, of course, losing the support we had from EU legislation, which is actually moving ahead on this. So we have a lot of problems there. But you highlight the point about where, we're continually, there's an issue between solidarity and organizing and working together and challenging and trying to get things done, and at certain points where we actually need better laws and better enforcement. Has anybody else got a question that they would like to ask? I've sort of lost track a bit of the chat. Janet, have you spotted anybody we should call on?
Deborah
Vale.
made
Yes,
a comment.
Deborah, would you like to ask a question?
I don't think I want to ask a question. I just raised an issue of when a senior manager spoke to a cleaner who had the cleaner had said the waste bags were too heavy, and the senior manager said, well, one's heavy, one's just fine. Luckily, the cleaner was able to respond. They weren't shy. That's able to respond to the senior manager. So it's trying to give people a voice to feel confident to say.
Yes.
And they did mention health and safety, the reason why they're too heavy. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And there should be a risk assessment. I mean, he was wrong and she was right, but that's very difficult. And you're right, people have to have the confidence to challenge things like that. And there could easily have been some sexism in that and some implications if you should just get on with it, and if she couldn't cope, that was her problem. Una, you've got your hand up. Thank you, Deborah. Una?
Oh, hi. Just a couple of points. Sorry, it's the same stuff I say at every health and safety meeting. I haven't actually read your book, Karen, but it sounds totally wicked. Like, my background is health and safety, occupational health and safety, trying to, get women or bring that gendered approach to it. And some of the stuff that I like that you were talking about is about the stuff about shame. For me, it isn't about shame about being a woman, but like, we have just so much responsibility on us all the time, whether we're mothers, workers, sisters, whatever. It's the feeling of shame of like letting people down all the time. That's the sort of shame that I feel, that I carry around with me. And yeah, I really, really appreciate you saying that. I suppose the main point is sort of backing up Kat's point, which is about, being a woman in the trade union movement, being a militant, being in the class struggle, being about health and safety, being a health and safety rep. Obviously we need to raise these things, but there is the thing about being a woman in the movement. And like, whenever I encourage like my sisters or women that I think that'd be really, really good health and safety reps to become health and safety reps, I sort of feel like I have to say to them, like, well, actually, this is going to impact on your health and safety because of the sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia in the movement. That's the sort of stuff that I feel like we have to challenge. Like we have to challenge these things in society. But the very first barrier, or one of the barriers that I face, I'm sure we all do, is from our comrades. Caroline spoke about release and stuff like that, and I totally get that. And I have spoke about this before, about the fact that if you make the decision to become involved in your union or become the health and safety rep and stuff like that, there is the issue of release. But ultimately, you're going to be doing all this work late at night when your kids, if you've got them, are at bed and stuff like that. And that's another barrier. And the thing about shame as well, actually, sorry. My children are in the background and I'm like making food at the same time as well. So my thoughts might just be a little bit off, but I did a really, really good workshop years ago, and it was about sexual assault in the workplace and shame. And like, women, we were all just talking about being women workers, and actually how many of us have been assaulted in the workplace and never spoke about it because we were shamed. And like this super comrade said, like basically we need to make a website, or we need to tattoo this on our this phrase on our girl children's head. It's not your fault. Like none of these things are our fault. And really it's only through meetings like this that we talk about it and realize it's a structural thing. Yeah, sorry, I'm waffling, but I just wanted to say that.
No, that's fine.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody.
That's fine, Una. Thank you very much indeed. And I mean, I think the point is a meeting like this is part of the fighting back. It is part of actually doing something about it. It is part of fighting shame by actually speaking out and knowing that it's a safe place to speak out. We've got support here, and we're, at the beginning of maybe trying to take something on. And I think it's important that, Karen's book has come at a very apposite time for us. On International Women's Day this year, Shavanah and I spoke at a TUC event that Shelley Asquith organised, who's on this call somewhere. There was an incredible outpouring of anger and a real appetite to actually do something about all these things and to take on the health and safety issues for women again in a way that I don't think I'd heard for several years. And we spoke very much about the urgent need for trade unions and the TUC to make spaces and mechanisms for women to actually come together and start talking about these things openly and freely and working out ways to actually fight against them, to put these things on the agenda, to name the issues and to organize and develop solidarity to make things a great deal better. And a clear understanding that sex and gender neutral health and safety was not good for women, probably not good really for anybody, and a desire to perhaps regenerate a TUC group, which was called GOSH, the Gender and Occupational Safety and Health Group, which did a lot of work around campaigning for and providing information and data, and providing a lot of the information that Karen's been producing and showing us today in terms of gender sensitive, sex and gender sensitive risk assessment and health and safety. And Shelley has already taken that up and has held some meetings and is looking at, rejuvenating and perhaps reorientating that group to try and, provide some space and some focus and some organizing mechanisms and ability for this very issue that we're talking about today. So I think we're not going to solve the problems that Karen and Caroline and all of you know about and have raised. We're not going to solve them here. We know some of the solutions. We know it's a fight. It is a battle. It is a battle for our health and safety. And we do know that solidarity and talking about our shame and organizing around that is something we have to do. And we have to work out some ways of doing that. And that is what we will be trying to do, taking it on from now. Are there any other questions? Does anybody else want to ask a question? Because I'm going to ask Karen and Caroline to just say a few words before we finish. If there are no more questions or comments anybody would like to make.
Hilda, can I just say,
Janet, sorry. Yeah.
Can I just say the illustration on the book is absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful. I mean, I've been active for 40 years in the trade union movement. I came into the movement in a women's committee and trying to challenge in a male dominated industries, as Kat was talking about. I went into British Aerospace, so 90% men, and, you know, sexual harassment and sexual inappropriate behavior was rife then. And I thought we'd gone through some of that. And, you know, I'm horrified, as Caroline and others have said, that we are still facing those issues in our workplaces and still trying to challenge those issues, you know. So thank you so much for raising those issues, Karen. And it's, you know, it's something that we can, you know, sort of build on in the Hazards campaign. But I didn't see any more questions. Sorry, if that's what I was going to say.
No, but that's very important, Janet. Thank you very much for that. I think what Janet's point about how brilliant the illustration is a very well made one. But I think also Janet's point that we're all realizing and are really quite disappointed to be taking a look around and actually seeing how things are going backwards to some extent, and how we still have some of the old sexist, misogynist problems, and issues around sexual abuse and sexual assault are far more common, and we are hearing more about them. But the basic issues about, you know, work not being designed for women's bodies or for women's lives is there, and possibly getting worse. And we do have to take it up. We have to have a renewed battle on this. Can I ask Caroline, would you like to say a few words to finish, and then we'll ask Karen to finish off for us?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, well, thank you again for having me and for letting me speak. It's been really amazing to hear you, Karen, and to hear more depth about the stories that you write about in the book. It is really, really such a fantastic book. I really recommend everyone who hasn't read it go out and buy it now, because it's illuminating. And I think actually also for those women who are on the front lines right now, trying to do this work, trying to make the changes in their workplace, it is actually also very informative and very helpful, and might make you angry and frustrated, but also I think is ultimately inspiring. So thank you, Karen, for writing it, and thank you for doing the work that you've been doing for so long.
Thank you, Caroline. Anger is important. Anger can often be a starting point. Can I just ask David, first of all, before Karen finishes off? David, would you just like to tell us how we can get the book?
Oh, I'm sitting on my couch. Oh my Lord. Hello, everyone, I'm Dave. I work at Between the Lines. Just to say, in the UK, there's been great demand for the book, which is fantastic. That means it's out of stock already at Blackwell's, but online retailers like Foyles and Waterstones have it in. You might have to be a little patient. It might take a few days extra to arrive, but it's well worth the wait. Also, the ebook is available through our web store at Between the Lines. Anywhere in the world, you can buy the ebook and read it on your e-reader. I'll drop those links in one more time. And also at your local bookstore and local library, you can check for the book. And if they don't have it, give them a nudge, tell them it's such a great book, they should really carry it. And again, thanks so much for everyone who spoke, and to Hazards for organizing.
Thanks very much, David. It's really good to hear it's going well. Thank you very much. Karen, would you just like to round up with anything you would like to say?
Well, I guess I would like to say thank you. I mean, I would like to say thank you first to Hilda and Janet for doing all this organization, which is usually invisible, so we should make it visible. And to my idol, Carolyn Creado Perez, who has written, I mean, if you haven't read Invisible Women and you have any money left over after buying my book, then you should definitely go and buy it. I have two copies. I have an ebook and I have the actual real book, so I can give it to my students. And I should probably buy some other copies and just give them out in my workplace. It's wonderful. And if you want to stay angry, because I think everybody's correct in saying that we need to be angry a lot, then you want to go and subscribe to her newsletter, because it makes me angry every week. This last week, I don't want to spoil it for you, but this last week was particularly enraging. And then everybody else who was really fitted this into their overwhelming schedules, because anybody in the union movement has got an overwhelming schedule. One word about that, just because somebody was talking about women's committees, is one of the problems we had in women's committees is that women with children tend not to be able to participate in them. And so you have to be very, very careful about being considerate and making it possible for women with children to participate in women's committees, because they have a whole bunch of issues that other women don't have. And the other thing that's important for the women's committees is to develop those links with the other committees, like the health and safety committees in the broader union movement, so that because we aren't experienced in getting heard, and the occupational health and safety people are usually quite good at getting heard. So it's good to develop those partnerships. And finally, just tremendous respect for the Hazards Campaign. I've been admiring you for years. I read the newsletter, I think the magazine. I think you're wonderful. And so thank you very, very much for having me.
Thank you very, very much, Karen. I think we are all so incredibly grateful that you have given us your time to speak about it. And your book, all your books are fantastic. This book is absolutely brilliant, and I do recommend everybody to read it. It's written in an absolutely brilliant way. It will make you look at things in a different way, and it will help us in terms of organizing. The issues you're talking about about women's committees, we're going to have to look at new mechanisms, because a lot of women's issues in UK trade unions have been sort of caught up in equalities committees and things, and there are issues around how we actually deal with all of these things. I think the issue about inclusiveness is really important, and not excluding women with children. And maybe there are ways in which, the Zoom meetings that we've all got so used to are one way in which, women with children can be more included. We have to look at all of these sorts of things. We've got a huge amount of work to do, but I think it's very clear that there is a great need, and there is an enormous appetite to do this. And there is huge amounts of information and advice and data and mechanisms and analysis, and really good honesty about conflicts that we have to tackle and be honest about in your book, Karen, and loads of data in your book, Caroline. And we've heard very much from Shavanah. Thank you very much to all of the speakers and all of you who've taken part, and to Janet for organizing this and also your contributions. So thank you all very much indeed. Go away and buy Karen's book, and keep safe, sisters. Thank you.